Good afternoon, and welcome to Gender Politics and Law, or Gender Law and Rights. I forget what all names I've given it. Gender Law and Politics, according to the slide here. This is the final of our Foundations lectures. Many of you are probably familiar with the reminder that Abigail Adams sent to her husband John when he was at the Second Continental Congress in the spring of 1776, debating, minor issues like the independence of the 13 English colonies. And they had a voluminous correspondence with each other. And one of the things that she wrote, she said, "And by the way of the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. That your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute. But such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. Why then not put it out of the power of the vicious and the lawless to use us with cruelty and indignity with impunity? Men of sense in all ages abhor those customs which treat us only as the vassals of your sex. Regard us then as beings placed by Providence under your protection and in imitation of the Supreme Being. Make use of that power only for our happiness." It's less well known what John Adams wrote in response. This is his reply. "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh. We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere, that children and apprentices are disobedient, that schools and colleges were grown turbulent, that Indians slighted their guardians and Negroes grew insolent to their masters. But your letter was the first intimation that another tribe, more numerous and powerful than all the rest, were grown discontented. This is rather too coarse a compliment, but you are so saucy, I won't blot it out. Depend upon it, we know better than to repeal our masculine systems. Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go and fair and softly, and in practice, you know, we are the subjects. We have only the name of masters, and rather than give this up, which would completely subject us to the despotism of the petticoat, I hope General Washington and all our brave heroes would fight. I'm sure every good politician would plot as long as he would against despotism, empire, monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy, or ochlocracy. A fine story indeed. I begin to think the ministry as deep as they are wicked, after stirring up Tories, land jobbers, trimmers, bigots, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, Russians, Irish Roman Catholics, Scotch renegados. At last they have stimulated the women to demand new privileges and threaten to rebel. One of the questions then is this just a joke between the two of them? Are they serious? I like to think that perhaps Abigail was more serious in her reply or in her initial reminder than John was in his response. But you notice what's interesting about John's response is the group within which he now lumps women. These are the folks that the British ministry is what he's referring to, are stirring up to oppose the colonials and their drive for independence. And so that women are one with, Tories, land jobbers, land grabbers, trimmers, bigots, Canadians, Indians, Negroes, Hanoverians, Hessians, blah, 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 blah. But it also indicates that thinking people, and Abigail and John Adams both were very well educated. Educated people were aware of the legal and social limitations that women lived under and how those limitations benefited men. The thinkers of the 18th century, which is often referred to as the Enlightenment, argued that it was man's rationality and ability to reason that was the foundation of individual liberty and rights. Probably the most famous expression of this comes from John Locke, whom we met before in talking about sensational psychology. He also wrote 2 treatises of government, and in the second one in particular, he argues that power in the political system comes from the bottom up, from the consent of the governed, that individual humans agreed to give up a portion of their liberty to the state in order to enjoy the benefits of law and order, if I may say so. So it was women's lack of independence as individuals, as well as their supposed lack of rationality, that made them ineligible to be full citizens. They were dependent, if not on their fathers, then on their husbands, and if not on their husbands, then their brothers or their sisters or whomever, unless, and even if they could make their own living, women were still seen as dependent. So that in political theory in the time, just as John Adams linked women with all of these other opponents of independence, political thinkers in the 18th century lumped women with children, the insane, the poor, those who were dependent on, if not the charity, then certainly the support of others. And they often included soldiers in that group too. When, soldiers are obliged, they must obey orders and therefore lack the independence, and they are dependent on the army for their support. So this debate, between John and Abigail Adams is indicative of some of the kinds of ideas that are circulating and percolating in the 18th century. I want to take a step back and in fact an ocean width back to England to talk about some of the legal foundations of gender relations in the Anglo-American tradition. And one of the first things that you have to reference if you're going to understand the origins of women's rights and even of the whole concept of rights is the idea of the English common law. In the English tradition, Parliament could make law. So there was, and that was called statute law. Someone proposed a bill, it passes and becomes a statute once the king signs it. There is also, however, a body of law that is considered the common law. It's sort of, well, this is what we've always done kind of stuff. Or this is what, when you think in common sense terms, so that yes, murder is a crime and theft is a crime. But in the development of the English common law tradition, there are 2 important concepts that come out of this that are going to be important here. First is the term femme covert. It's a Norman French term, legally a legal term, and its literal meaning is a covered woman. This was the common law phrase used to describe the legal position of married women, and I want to emphasize the married. This concept of a covered woman only applies to married women. And according to one of the most famous and respected legal scholars of the 18th century, a man named Sir William Blackstone, This is how he characterizes it, quote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband." A variation on this, a kind of catchphrase is, "The two shall become one, and the one is him." Right. So in essence, married women do not exist legally. They cannot testify in court. They cannot sign contracts. Um, Anything that they own, down to and including their clothes on their backs and the children of their bodies, belongs to their husband or to her husband. Their husbands? All right. Now, if you were not married, if you were single, if you never married, or if you were a widow, you could own property, you could sign contracts, and all of that sort of thing. And there were legal ways in which the wealthy made arrangements, usually at the time of an arranged marriage, that would protect some property or wealth on behalf of the young woman, so that her family's contribution, her dowry, as it were, would, if her husband died, perhaps, come back to her, kind of thing. Notice, though, that the significance of property here. Why was property so important? Because property and the ownership of land in the English way of thinking comes to be synonymous with independence. That when you have a sufficient quantity of property, you are beholden to no one, and therefore you can vote your conscience. You can vote for who's going to do a good job rather than necessarily who's going to benefit you the most. So to have a say in public debates, in political rituals, and the institutions of political power like voting, the best safeguard, the English thought, against corruption and tyranny was the independent voter. And property is what gives you that independence. So everyone who voted in England had to meet some kind of property requirement. Although there were, believe me, there's a whole slew of different kind of variations on this. But for the most part, just take my word for it, the amount of property you had to own could vary. The vote could perhaps follow, a position. Like in London, the Lord Mayor and the City Council get to vote. In other places, if you paid the local taxes, you got to vote. So that, there was a huge variety of this. The most common and well-known kind of property requirement was for voters in what were called the counties. There were 42 counties. You had to own 40 shillings freehold, meaning that you had to own outright in your own, possession, land that produced products, or, was rented for at least 40 shillings. This was a threshold that was set in 1429, and they will not change it until 1832. Given the effects of inflation over the period between 1429 and 1832, this meant in some places, like the county of Middlesex, that took in most of metropolitan London, the number of voters was huge. Over 10,000 men could vote. So these two things are going to, the idea of women being absorbed, married women being absorbed into the legal identity of their husbands, and the need for independence and, of course, rationality will be big determiners in the process by which American ideas and law develop. I did include in the lecture a reference to the debates of the 1640s, just to show you that some of these concepts and ideas have been debated for a long time. If the Enlightenment was interested in rationality and in the importance of the individual human being, they were also interested in the idea of equality. And one of the reasons that some of the Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and like Locke were seen as kind of, not quite with it, is that they argued against the social hierarchy of Europe. And it was a fairly rigid, system based in who your family is, where, who you were born into, and wealth. It wasn't, one or the other. In our society, it's mostly wealth, right? But in 18th century Europe, it also mattered who your family was. Were you of noble birth, for example? But the most classic statement about the idea of equality in a political sense is, of course, in that most famous of American documents, the Declaration of Independence. Oh, here's my, and there's Sir William Blackstone. Property also connected you to your country. So we come to 1776. We hold these truths to be self-evident, meaning they're obvious, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke, by the way, had said life, liberty, and property. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So you can see that Jefferson has been reading John Locke. But this phrase raises questions, right? I mean, it's interesting that Abigail Adams was writing before the Declaration of Independence was published. And of course, when the Continental Congress approved the Declaration, they pretty much knew or thought they knew what it meant, right? Men meant white, property holding males. And who are the governed that give their consent? White, property owning males. Adult males, I suppose I should add. But to say that all men are created equal raises the question of who is a man? Because in English, the term man or mankind can refer to both sexes. Are Indians men? Are Negroes? Are African Americans men? Equal in what sense? Are they equal in their lifestyles? Equal in terms of their access to law and power? And of course, if you're right, you have a right to liberty. Liberty to do what? And of course, the big $64,000 question: how do you fit this statement in the Declaration of Independence with the reality of American chattel slavery? The English, by the way, were not slow to point out this discrepancy, or this, what's the word I want? Dissonance between our espoused ideals and the reality of American society, and so that they published pamphlets and things that mocked the Americans for claiming that they wanted liberty when half of us were slaveholders. Well, of course, the Revolutionary War had actually begun before the Declaration of Independence. And once we move past the Revolution and the Articles of Confederation, and we move into the period where the Constitution comes into effect in the 1780s, the United States emerges then as a federal republic, meaning a representative government. Federal in the sense that there are the component, the 13 component parts, but they are linked into a federation. and that the government then that is associated with the federal government has considerable power over the individual states. But there were some things, of course, that were left to the states, and there were other various checks and balances, as we say, on the power of the central government. The division of responsibility for government between the executive, legislative, and judicial, that the executive is the one who carries out and makes sure that the law is enforced or is enacted, or is put into action. The legislature, with the power of the purse and the ability to oversee the work of the executive branch. And of course, the judicial branch, in the Constitution, it doesn't say a whole lot. And it's, one of these things, like in the English common law, that because we share that, the idea of, well, how do we decide what's right, in a legal case, or who's right? Well, what have we decided before, in like cases? This idea of precedent, as you may know, is very significant in American judicial decisions. But a lot of stuff was left to the states, including the question about marriage and gender relations. One of the checks and balances also, of course, was the Bill of Rights, that several states only agreed to approve the Constitution with the understanding that the first thing that would happen when the new government formed was that it would be amended, that the Constitution would be, that there would be a Bill of Rights. And of course, whose rights are in question here? Who got the vote? Well, the usual suspects, the males, the whites, sane property owners. But of course, the Constitution could be amended. We could change it. All right, so the American experience of revolution and government making, constitution making, was very unusual and startlingly different at the time. One of the interesting effects of the American Revolution was to spark revolution elsewhere. And the most famous example of that is in France. Remember, France had supported the United States in the revolution as we fought the British. What the French got out of supporting the United States wasn't a whole lot. They actually weren't there, I don't think, at the negotiations of the treaty that ended the revolution. And they got 2 islands off of Canada back, but they didn't recover anything of what they had lost to Britain in the 18th century. They also ended up with, a boatload of debt. I mean, they were already in debt when they went into this war, and this was just one war too many. The French Revolution then broke out in the summer of 1789, and the great symbolic act that is marked to commemorate that is the fall of the Bastille on the 14th of July, 1789. The Bastille was a prison in Paris that was on the edge of one of the biggest working class districts, just to remind the hoi polloi on the ground as to who was in charge. Of course, the irony is that by the time it was stormed by the people of Paris looking for weapons, there were only about 7 people in there, most of whom were people who were insane. Anyway, another link then, between the American and French Revolution is in the person of the Marquis de Lafayette. He was, an officer who served with Washington, and as a very young man, he was in his 20s when in the American Revolution. So he goes home to France and, of course, takes the ideals and ideas of the American Revolution to France. it's one of the kind of funny things. When he came back to the United States in later decades to visit, one of the things he gifted or he gave to George Washington was a key to the Bastille. Um, well, the French Revolution was in part, or not in part, because it was about the question of how would France be governed and by whom. Um, and being French, they sit down and decide, well, first of all, they're going to write a constitution. And they decide to put their Bill of Rights as, the equivalent, up front as the preamble to their constitution, rather than leaving it to be amended like we did in ours. So we have in August of 1789, the publication of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And in this, Article 1 is men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on common utility. I'm going to come back around to this. I just want to talk a little bit about the French Revolution. Women were involved in the French Revolution from the start, as were American women in the American Revolution. There were women amongst the conquerors of the Bastille. I don't know if you can do the photograph or the painting shows any of them, but we know this because later the French government granted pensions to people who could prove that they were there and helped to conquer the Bastille, and some of them were women. In October of 1789, a group of Parisian women went out to Versailles, which is about 20 miles outside of Paris, because they were fed up with the king kind of hiding out in Versailles, and they wanted him in Paris, where he had to, hear their grievances and listen to their complaints. When they brought the king, his queen, and his son, from Versailles to Paris, one of the things they chanted along the way is that they were bringing the baker, the baker's wife, and the baker's son to Paris. The connection of the king to food was very significant. And again, it was part of why women were involved in this. So we get, then the Constitution writing that goes on over about a 2-year period. And by 1792, however, the revolution is moving increasingly to a more radical stance, radical even by 18th century standards. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, and notice again, the title is significant because it's not the Declaration of the Rights of Frenchmen, it's the Declaration of the Rights of Man, of mankind. And it included things that Americans would have found familiar, freedom and equality, freedom of speech, the press and religion, due process in criminal law, equal sharing of tax and government service burdens, and so on and so forth. But this Constitution gets rejected by 1792, as does the monarchy. So they go from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional monarchy to a republic. And we get, beginning in the fall of 1792, the period that's known as the Reign of Terror, or the radical phase of the French Revolution, where they're going to have a whole new world, right? They remake the calendar. They try to remake the language. There's going to be no more vous, no more formal presentations. Everybody's going to be addressed by the familiar tu. They have new currency. They have new ways of addressing one another. It's no more, hello, my lord. It's going to be no hello, citizen or citizeness. even what you wore, had kind of political connotations. Women continued and even expanded their political participation in things like political clubs, where they would have debates about the issues of the day, or they would petition the legislature about things that they cared about. For women, often it had to do with the price of food, as well as other kinds of rights and topics. Because as you can imagine, for some women, if you're going to talk about the rights of man, which of course in French is les droits de les hommes, right, the rights of the man, then what about the droits de les femmes, right, the rights of women? Those of you who studied French or Spanish may recall, or I don't know if it's true in Spanish, it's certainly true, it's true in French. If you have a group of 10,000 women and you add one man, it then becomes a masculine group, and the pronouns that are used to refer to it are masculine. So out of that, the participation of women in the political culture and the Declaration of the Rights of Man, we do get the Declaration of the Rights of Woman that was put forward by a woman named Olympe de Gouges, who essentially does a parody of the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Woman is born free and remains equal to man in rights. Social distinctions may be based only on common utility. Same thing, right? One of the ones I've always found interesting is this one, which is about freedom of speech. No one should be disturbed for his fundamental opinions. Woman has the right to mount the scaffold, so she should have the right equally to mount the rostrum, provided that these manifestations do not trouble public order as established by law. So that if you're going to hold women accountable to the law, then they have the right to have an opinion about the law and to make that opinion known. As long as, of course, you don't whip up the riots. And de Gouges adds one that was not in the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and this is the number 11 here. Again, a version or variation on the freedom of speech and of opinion. The free communication of thoughts and opinions is one of the most precious of the rights of woman, since this liberty assures the recognition of children by their fathers. Every citizeness may therefore say freely, I am the mother of your child. A barbarous prejudice against unmarried women having children should not force her to hide the truth, right? So she's essentially saying that freedom of speech is also going to include the freedom to name the father of your illegitimate child. Makes you wonder what happened to her. Anyway. Another document that comes out of the French Revolutionary period is one that was written in English by Mary Wollstonecraft, and this is The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. It's not an easy book to read. She's not the best of writers, but she, like de Gouges, is struck by, if we're going to talk about the rights of men, what about the rights of women? She had spent her life as a governess and a writer, and she published this in 1792. Her main thrust of this book, as a teacher in a sense, is that the reason that women were so, such airheads, was that they were not educated. You can see how that fits with Locke's idea about human nature, right? That we are what we are educated to become. And she argues that women would be rational if they would be educated rationally. And this is, I think, a good as any quotation that illustrates this. She says, "Liberty is the mother of virtue, and if women are, by their very constitution, slaves and not allowed to breathe the sharp, invigorating air of freedom, they must ever languish like exotics and be reckoned beautiful flaws in nature. Let it also be remembered that they are the only flaw." Um, and so she you know, argues that liberty leads to virtue, and if you want virtuous women, you need women who are free to learn and to be what they want. She also, at one point in the book, just asserts that the wrongs of women can be traced to one basic cause: uh, the lack of chastity in men. So again, educated people like the Adamses debating the issue of women's position in politics, women's rights, right from the beginning of our republic. As we move into the 19th century, women's involvement in politics and questioning about the law comes out of a couple of different types of experiences. When we talked about, or when I talked about the cult of true womanhood, and I mentioned that women found ways in building from the expectations of that type of role, they also found ways to work in the public arena. And we talked about, or I talked about Christian missions and about charity efforts and this sort of thing, so that women participated in a variety of reform movements that could be argued were part of woman's sphere. Often these were causes or issues related to Christianity, to religious commitment. I suppose we could also include, the fact that women did support the American Revolution by boycotting British goods and supporting the military. Some women lent money to the United States government. But other reforms that caught women's eyes and effort included working for more education. The Beecher family, for example, Harriet Beecher Stowe and her sister Catherine were big on women's education. Christian missions, we've already talked about that. And temperance will become, is one that becomes increasingly important. Temperance meaning anti-alcohol. These were women who were campaigning for, if not the outright ban of alcohol sales, then at least the more tighter regulation of it. They saw alcohol and alcoholism as a threat to the home and to women and children. These will be causes that will continue to resonate, but there are the two most important ones for understanding the emergence of the women's rights movement are, first of all, the women's rights movement itself, but it grows out of the experience of women in the abolitionist movement, the people who were fighting against slavery. I want to distinguish between two things here. One is, when you talk about abolition, we generally think of the abolition of slavery. First, however, people campaigned for the abolition of the slave trade, to stop shipping people from Africa to the New World. And in England, this cause became supported very much by Quakers and a branch of the Church of England who were known eventually as evangelicals. They were not kind of the same type of evangelicals we talk about today, but just take my word for it. And both out of evangelical circles and Quaker circles, women were very active in drawing up and circulating petitions, of participating in public meetings and demonstrations, writing letters to their members of parliament, pressuring their husbands to write letters to parliament. And they also, of course, included, or the cause included men. One of the key leaders of it in Britain, it was a man named William Wilberforce. If you've ever seen, there's a film out called Amazing Grace that is about Wilberforce and this effort. It's pretty good, although for some reason they have the House of Lords and the House of Commons together, which, never mind. The reason that this, they begin campaigning against this in the 1780s and 90s. It takes, 15, 20 years to accomplish what they want. They get resistance from, first of all, the government itself. The government was indebted in a sense to people who benefited from the slave trade. That included, slave merchants and people who engaged in the trade out of places like Bristol, London, Liverpool. You may have heard this past spring with the Black Lives Matter demonstrations in Britain, they tore down and tossed into the ocean a statue of a slave trader. And of course, the colonial landowners who often had connections and power in England itself. And so, you get this kind of combination, which for a long time manages to resist this change. Eventually, however, Wilberforce and the abolitionists prevail, and the slave trade in Britain comes to an end in 1807. Slavery will not be outlawed in the British Empire until the 1830s. Slavery in Britain had been essentially outlawed from the mid-1770s by the result of a legal case. But it will be the 1830s, and it will be at the cost of several million, if not billion pounds, paid to colonial slaveholders as compensation for their lost property. This is Wilberforce. He also was involved in fighting cruelty to animals and things like that. In the United States, the slave trade was also ended in 1807 because it was a provision of the Constitution. In Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, it says, "The migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now existing shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 1808, but a tax or duty may be imposed on such importation, not exceeding $10 for each person." So if you wade through the legalese, basically Congress, the federal government cannot forbid the slave trade until 1808. So it did once we roll around into 1708. But as you probably know, slavery will not end in the United States officially, at any rate, until the 15th Amendment, or is it the 13th or 14th Amendment to the Constitution after the Civil War. Here too, women were very prominent in the anti-slavery and anti-slave trade movements. Among the most famous are the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina. They came from a very wealthy, well-to-do, and extensive slave-owning family in South Carolina. However, I think it was Sarah had gone north to Philadelphia and as a result had gotten to know some Quakers, and influenced by them, she converted to Quakerism and to anti-slavery agitation. And then her sister joined her, and the two of them began to speak in public. And this was part of what was kind of shocking about them. But I think it's Angelina argues, this is such an important and moral and Christian cause that she cannot be silent. And so she must speak. She got, booed and things thrown at her. And in one of the places she was supposed to speak, somebody set it on fire. But she persisted. In the wake of the Second Great Awakening also, again, that religious fervor moved some people in the direction of supporting abolition. And we find then a great number of women involved in this cause, including people like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, all of whom are going to be key and important leaders of the women's rights movement. That's Lucretia, Mrs. Mott, and that's Elizabeth Cady Stanton with one of her 6 kids. In 1830, it's Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton who have what in the 1960s would have been called a consciousness-raising movement. They went to London, and of course, keep in mind that's not an easy option in 1830. But they went to London in order to attend a conference on abolition of slavery. When they got there, they went as official delegates of the United States branch of the cause. But when they got there, they found that women were not recognized as official delegates, and that therefore they could not sit amongst the other representatives from the United States, nor could they speak in the convention. Needless to say, they were not happy with that result. When they returned to the States, then they began to inquire and began to mull over this question of women's legal status and why was it, okay to exclude women from something like a convention. And so Mott and Stanton come to the conclusion that we have to talk about women's right to be heard and seen in public, to have the equal political right with men of the vote in order to achieve these other social and reform goals. And they came to believe that unless women had political power in their own right, politicians were free to ignore them as much as they liked. They don't vote. Why should, a senator or congressman pay any attention to what women think? Cady Stanton is particularly important here. She was the daughter of a judge, and her brother had died as a young man, and so her father, being very disappointed to lose his only son, in essence educated Elizabeth almost like a son. So she learned about the law and the common law and the traditions. And she knew a lot of lawyers. She was also a wife and mother. But interestingly enough, her husband wasn't home much because he was also an abolitionist and he was out on the road for the cause. She had 7 kids, which limited her mobility, but not her organizing fervor. It was Cady Stanton then and Mott who called together a meeting for the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States. And this was the newspaper invitation that appeared in the Seneca County. I don't know why I can't. Anyway, it's in one of the local newspapers, right? So, and as you can see, a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women will be held in the Wesleyan Chapel and Methodist Chapel at Seneca Falls, New York, on Wednesday and Thursday, the 19th and 20th of July, commencing at 10 a.m. During the first day, the meeting will be exclusively for women, which all are earnestly invited to attend. The public generally are invited to be present on the second day when Lucretia Mott of Philadelphia and others, both ladies and gentlemen, will address the convention. 300 people showed up, men and women, including Frederick Douglass, so that it was an interesting interesting mix of people. In the end, what they produced is what we'll be talking about on our next class meeting, which is the Declaration of Sentiments. I hope you'll enjoy reading it. The link to the text is in Moodle, and I'll look forward to discussing it with you.